Welcome back everyone to another episode of the Build and Learn series. So if you watched the last episode, you saw a bunch of how I start to plan and figure out where things are going generally. And today we are going to start working on the infrastructure to support those ideas. So we're back in Stanford Bay, and today we're going to focus on roads and rails. But this is the natural next step to getting our city up and running. Not only do we need to focus on this, but it also helps you plan out your city and what you're going to be building later. And just a reminder, if you are new, be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you like the videos and you like the series, hit the like, leave a comment down below with what you think we should be doing in some of the upcoming episodes. I'd really appreciate it. And with that, let's get on to messing around with some roads. So our first segment here is really going to be focused on getting a lot of volume to the downtown area. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, my focus is really setting up downtown first because I feel like that can scale everything else, right? That can also scale roads and how you plan to filter enough volume of people into that area based on the scale that you've chosen for your downtown. I will admit that I'm not the best at road design. I look for things to be aesthetically pleasing and I try to make things as realistic as possible without going super overboard. I want things to feel right for the city, but I think I mostly tend to struggle with interchanges. That's something that I just have never been able to do very smoothly or efficiently. If you also struggle with this, I would recommend checking out some of the YouTube tutorials or just leaning on the Steam Workshop to help you get started. I'm going to be leaning on a couple today just to help me get going with the city. My initial strategy here is to give us options for interchanges that will filter traffic into different areas that I'm setting up within the city. For example, it can be really important to make sure your industrial area has access to a highway system along with your downtown and major population areas. So obviously I don't want the highway super far from downtown. I want some sort of relatively close connection to the highway system. So I'm going to basically bridge the gap between the space of where the highway is laid out on the map and where I want to place the sort of epicenter of downtown on the peninsula. So my first step is trying to get this highway system in place that is already here, pre-existing, to slowly move into the area that I want to do most of my building within. Now I look at major roads like arteries, right? And then smaller roads like veins, and your arteries should drive most of your volume. So that's going to be like highways, big avenues, and things like that. Your smaller roads should extend beyond them. And I think I've mentioned before in previous videos that I sometimes look at roads like trees. So you have your tree trunk running up, and then you have your smaller roads extending off of that and filtering traffic into different areas. So for example, you may have an avenue running past the neighborhood, and then everything inside the neighborhood is smaller roads. It's a very baseline example. But that begins to create a road hierarchy system in terms of having roads with higher capacity around areas with the smaller roads filtering traffic into different pockets. I've always felt like choosing roads very carefully can contribute to the realism of the city, especially when you're zoomed out looking down on it. And something else that I started to consider later after seeing so many people do like really beautiful highway lines through their city was trying to find a way to make my highways look more realistic, but also aesthetically pleasing, really. And something that I tried to do a little bit later in my process of learning cities is I take larger roads, highways, avenues, and I make them less pliable. I don't want really hard curves or bends in them as often. So I try to focus on curves that are less aggressive. And then I always try to go back to a straight line as quickly as I can when I'm drawing out the roads. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that if geographics of your map indicate that you need to go around something or you need to alter the road to make sense in your area, for example, a body of water, a mountain, whatever it is, that is probably the best reason to start moving your roads around things and to give you a reason to create a curve or an angle or something like that. In other words, use the terrain to help guide where you're doing things, where you're taking your roads. And despite playing sandbox, I'm often weighing sort of the financial responsibility of a city, not in game, but just does this make sense for a city of this scale? So it makes sense for the city to decide, hey, we need to cross this river at the most narrow point to save money. Not have a curved bridge across the river or not have the most elegant bridge. Sometimes I choose very basic bridges or just use an elevated road to cross certain bodies of water or certain areas where I need them. Not only does this add to the variety of paths that I'm using over these sort of areas, like if I have multiple bridges, for example, but this also kind of indicates that we can't spend an elaborate amount of money on every single bridge or road or network. Not to mention, if you want something to be sort of featured, if you want to create something that grabs attention, you don't want to do it multiple times. You want to do it less, right? So that it continues to garner that attention. So if you have multiple bridges that are all these really fancy elevated bridges, they're all going to kind of blend together because the attention is going to be spread across them. Whereas if you have something different in one spot and then the rest are a little bit downplayed or lower key in terms of the attention you expect to get, it might actually make some of the features of your city pop. And that's not limited to bridges or roads. That's pretty much anything. So now that I've shifted our highways closer to where I want our downtown, I've also included multiple interchanges to help guide traffic to different pockets of the city. And hopefully that allows for traffic to flow pretty well through this area and bypass the area entirely. So now that we have some major arteries in place to guide traffic flow, I think it's time we jump to the downtown area, which I think again is one of the more critical areas that we develop early. So since I tend to build North American cities, I typically start off with a grid, especially in the downtown area. I realize that grids tend to get some hate, right? It's not everyone's favorite thing to do, but I kind of find it interesting. It's interesting because I try to find ways of breaking off that grid that look good or in their own way sort of complex. Additionally, trying to find where I can place organic lines within or around this grid is often pretty fun to do. Now that can either be pathing or roads, but I tend to use the geography of the map to help dictate where I can include those organic curved lines. And sometimes they're around borders. For example, here, I'm going to use it to put some sort of cap on the peninsula, and then on the bottom side I'm going to use some curved lines again to break up the monotony of just straight roads everywhere. I also don't necessarily want to do grids and just the same size boxes on repeat. I want to mix them up and consider them more like big city blocks where you have multiple larger buildings taking up that space. I'm going to set up this area pretty large, and then what we'll do is as we begin to place buildings, we'll have a better understanding of how much I need to divide it up further. As I said in the previous episode, the scaling might be a little bit off, especially when I'm getting started, and that can always change. We can always tweak it and adjust accordingly. I want you guys to not only just see the perfect city build that I'm trying to create, but I want you to see some of the trials and errors. And I know that can be a little more difficult with recorded content because we're trying to keep it to like a certain length, right? Whereas on Twitch or on stream, you're going to see it kind of happening live. So I want to incorporate some of these things where I'm tailoring things more to what we're getting at versus this magical plan I have in my head. Besides, finding instances where you have some sort of imperfection or something is slightly off isn't always the worst thing. Sometimes it actually makes your city your city. Now, speaking of making your city your city, a couple things that you should keep in mind is that roads should be considered part of detailing. And given that now we can embed different trees into the roads very easily, this is something you need to incorporate or start thinking about at some point. You know, where is your city located? Obviously, geographically is important and should help dictate this along with your city purpose. You know, obviously, if you have an area near industrial, you're probably not going to put as many trees attached to the road, but instead you use like worn out roads or the industrial roads. Whereas maybe in a modern downtown area near a beach, you want to use palm trees or coconut trees or something to add some verticality to your roads, which also handles some of the detailing that you would have to otherwise incorporate. I've talked about it before in other videos, maybe in my detailing videos, where it's, you know, try to find ways of working smarter, not harder. If you can find opportunities to customize areas or parts of your city with basic functionality, simple things, or a mod that kind of adds something to what you're doing without having to overextend yourself, that is big bonus to me. Especially something as simple as adding trees to roads, right? You can lay the road out and you can go ahead and have the customized tree that you picked added to that road, and then bam, you have some detailing already added to your city without going into a crazy spiral of having to do a whole lot of work to make that look the way you have in your head. And if you tailor it to match your city in terms of like what tree you select, for example, even better. So I've been able to outline this with more organic roads, and the interior is more of our grid focus. And you can see the major crossing intersection there, which is probably going to be heavily congested. We may have to tweak that later with another opportunity for folks to get into the city. But for now, I think we have a really cool setup here. I do feel like some of the blocks are relatively big, which again, I think will break down as we start to see where buildings are placed. I don't want to make it too narrow, but I also want to give myself some opportunity to change and alter things to customize around buildings that we end up putting in this space. I think it's really important to mix up your grids. You don't want them all moving in the same direction. You don't want them all to be equally spaced. That tends to get a little bit rigid, right? And while it can look realistic in certain situations, if it's done very, very well to match, again, many major North American cities, you also want to make sure that you add a little bit of variety to that. And that's going to really kind of customize your city and make it look more interesting. Now I'm looking to connect our downtown area to different parts of the city a little bit more efficiently. So I want a couple of opportunities where we cross the river and connect to some of the larger artery roads that are not on the peninsula currently. So for bridges, there's something I like to do very specifically. I like to have a slope on either end that matches in terms of distance from the terrain height to the ultimate bridge height, whatever the highest point is. And then I like 2 to 3 nodes between that and where the slope comes down, if that makes sense. So really you should have your terrain height and then a bridge height, not any additional heights in between. Those 2 to 3 nodes that you have that are at the bridge height that you specify should be even, not bumpy. You shouldn't have one height in the middle with outside heights unless you're just doing some sort of angled bridge or curved bridge. I typically like to keep mine straight across. It tends to look better in my eyes. Now you can see I'm building off lines that are already developed. So I have lines of the grid that meet this sort of area where I want to apply a bridge. Instead of trying to re-angle or do something different, I just continue with the grid line. Now, maintaining these lines can be helpful to kind of create a little bit of connectivity between two parts of your city, but also giving you the opportunity to find where you can branch off of some of those lines to create some dynamic areas that look different from something you've already established. So I guess the point is look for areas where you can create continuity between different sections. This, I think, is very, very good to help you establish areas that are different, but also cohesive. Now you can see how that cohesiveness will work once we zoom out. You can see where the lines are going, where we can continue to branch off of the main downtown area into different parts of the town in general. And of course, find opportunities where you can customize certain roads or bridges. In fact, the content creator pack where we've got some bridges is super, super helpful. So now that we have our downtown area kind of roughly sketched out, let's start working on this new area across the river. I'm thinking this could almost be like a Midtown. I know that I marked it for downtown. I think Midtown is pretty close to that anyways, but I'm thinking this is an area that sort of bridges a gap, a little bit of a transition, as we talked about in the last episode, to focus on how we transition away from downtown into different parts of the city. Something else I need to keep in mind is finding a space where we could put maybe a couple resorts on the beachfront. Maybe this is that spot. We'll see. I would like that intermix with downtown a little bit so I could see it being in a couple of areas near or around downtown. So obviously I want to connect it to some of the arteries we've already set up. And this is where setting these up appropriately can be very, very helpful, because now that I've kind of extended lines so I can see where things start to connect, right? I think there's something with drawing where they say to like overextend some of the lines you're putting down, right? So you can use it as some sort of reference or some sort of guide elsewhere. I'm not really sure what the rule is, as I'm not much of an artist, but I think that's very, very helpful, is to overextend some of your roads and lines, and you can find later where some of these things can connect or maybe even work better as you progress. And once again, I'm going to try to incorporate some grid and organic lines, continuing what we started in the downtown area in this space as well. And since I continued some of the lines, I think it's going to be rather cohesive. So I'm excited to see how this turns out once we start adding some buildings. Probably something I'll look at too in one of the future episodes is trying to figure out where we can include some pedestrian roads. Some of that can be utilized in between some of our blocks. Some of it can be utilized to add some extra little bits here and there along the coastline, right? If we want to have like a boardwalk type area, we can utilize pedestrian roads for that. So that's another added piece of variety you can plan to implement at some point. So now that we have our downtown shaping up and we've got a little midtown area plus some connections to our highway system, I want to get some train lines ran in for passengers. Now, some may suggest that you should do your train lines first, considering historically your train lines may be there longer than many of your roads. However, I'm more of the mindset that I need the roads down to start figuring out if downtown is going to be in a specific place, how large it is, and starting to get an idea of scale and things like that before I can really figure out where the train lines are going to go. However, I do agree that the train lines should have priority in most cases over the roads in terms of like which one should overlap the other one or how you connect them. Either way, I think both can work. However, I would make sure that you get some train lines down before you start adding buildings and zoning. I think once you start having buildings in and things like that, it's going to be hard for you to part ways with what you started to set up just for a train line. I will admit that I've always been fascinated with what folks have done with train lines and incorporating them into their city. It's really, really impressive. I've played with ideas where I have like sunken railways running through a downtown area, and I love doing that kind of stuff because it adds just neat little features to what you're building. For now, what I want to make sure is that we have a line running for passengers to get close to downtown. And then also what I want to do is I want to have a separate train line running specific to cargo and industry on the other side of town, closer to where I have industry marked to go. So how do I typically handle adding railways to a city? Well, I tend to keep them close to highways and roads. And similar to highways, I keep them a little bit less pliable. I don't want them to be too bendy or curvy all over the place. So I recommend typically having your railway curves exaggerated a bit, having them wide. And then when you can find decent straightaways, really let them stretch across that space. Allowing your railways to take up space and being a part of the map the way they are and really separating different areas can be really useful in making your city look pretty realistic. I like creating little dividers with different roads or railways just to set up different areas of the city. This is the same with like having a river or something like that, or some form of geographic change separating two areas. And of course, similar to roads, you can use geography to help dictate where you need or want your railways to go. If there's a coastline that you'd like the railway to be featured along, that's an opportunity to do something a little bit different and fun that might be unique to your city. It took me a little while to figure out how to incorporate a railway into our downtown or near it. In fact, I played with this for quite a while before I finally found an option that I thought was successful in terms of what I wanted. I'm not super focused on making this whole city rely very heavily on rails, although I think I would like to incorporate some sort of tram system in the downtown later. For now, I just want a passenger station nearby to allow for a steady flow of folks coming into the city access. And with some recent content creator packs, you have a large number of options in terms of what type of station you could put down, especially if you're playing a little bit closer to vanilla. I found a few of these options are really solid for what I typically want for a train system or a train station in town. So here you can see a simple division between where the rail is running and where the road is going to be for the train station itself. I'm not curving the rails to accommodate roads. Instead, I'm kind of doing the opposite, where the roads sort of fit where the rail is. Like I said earlier, you want to make sure your rails accommodate the trains and what they're capable of, so ensure that your curves or inclines make sense. I really do feel that train lines, and highways for that matter, should feel very simple in terms of how they maneuver across your map, and they should be flowing and not so abrupt in any sort of capacity, whether it's their incline or their curve. Now, I have an idea for how I can handle adding a cargo station on the other side of town near industrial. I wasn't sure I was going to quite get this done in this episode, but I think I have a fix for this, at least for a temporary solution. To accommodate this idea, I'm going to have to make some tweaks. So we're going to add another interchange and tweak some of the roads that we've already set up. Ultimately, I think this is a good idea to go ahead and get this in place so it's ready to go once we start diving into industries. Now, it doesn't mean it's permanent, but at least we will have what we need to start envisioning how to make it better. Now, I know some of you may question why I'm using vanilla rails and vanilla roads, and that's mainly just for accessibility so that more people can just utilize the stuff that I'm using, although I'm not opposed to changing this later. I used to use a lot of the North American railroad set for pretty much all my railroads, but just for this instance, I'm just going to use vanilla, at least to get us started. We can always upgrade it later. Same with the roads themselves, but I feel like right now in the game, we have a pretty good selection of roads. So obviously I'm adding a new interchange and I'm tweaking some of the artery roads that we set up, this avenue that runs a good length of the area that hopefully will help filter through traffic into other parts of the town. Now, keeping these train lines separate, passenger and cargo, will hopefully help with a little bit of the traffic you might see on your train lines. Keeping them doubled up where you have two sets of rails or something like that can help with the flow, especially if you realize it's getting a little bit clogged up or delayed in terms of trains being able to maneuver, especially as they enter the station. I'd really emphasize that none of this has to be permanent. I've done tons of builds where I've set up temporary things. So if you have a burning desire to get something down, or you just need to get something set up, but you're not really sure how to do it, it's okay to set up something in an area where you know it's going to be temporary and you can build upon or improve it later. For some reason, that tends to happen to me with industrial. I tend to lay things out as a temporary area that I can build upon later or make it look better, maybe more integrated with the map or the geography of the map or something. Sometimes it's just easy enough to get it set up, and then I start to figure out what those ideas are a little bit down the road. I think it's important not to end up in a situation where you're struggling with one idea and you can't get to the next idea, right? Don't halt progress for perfection. If you can make progress in certain areas, I think that'll help overall, because then you're not just sitting there stagnant and just trying to force something that isn't going to resonate at the time. It's also helpful too to take your time with certain things like that, because maybe you go back later and you realize, oh, I could have done this a different way. Sometimes that's a really helpful thought and very productive way of handling certain situations when you're trying to build something and you just got to figure out the ideas. I think the area where that's probably the most common for me to set up something and then go and change it, besides just like zoning areas or a specific part of town, maybe roads and rails. There's a lot of times that I don't do the rails very well and I am going to make adjustments later, or I got to go fix some roads because traffic's terrible because I didn't plan accordingly, and that's okay. Ultimately, we're our strongest critic, but you got to keep in mind too, as you're watching these videos and you see things that you want to give feedback on, obviously you can leave suggestions in the comments. I highly recommend that, as it's a good way for me to come up with ideas and maybe find my own inspiration through some suggestions you guys have. But also be patient with the fact that maybe I'm tailoring an area slowly but surely, and it'll improve over time. It's not the end all if I place it in this video, because I might go change it in episode 5. I don't feel like anything that I'm setting up is crazy complicated right now, and some of that is intentional. And some of it is just because that's not really always what I focus on, especially right out the gate. I want to get some roads laid down, and I want to try to make sure traffic's in a decent spot by the time we start adding buildings. But ultimately, this is still sort of a planning phase. As much as this is the second video and we've already done some planning, this is really the next step in getting us closer to where I feel like we can start putting buildings down and building a city. One thing I need to try and find is actually a better option for a cargo station, something maybe off the workshop that represents what I'm trying to set up a little bit more closely. If you guys have suggestions, obviously throw in the comments, but I'm not really sure of one right off the top of my head. I don't want to do too many crazy assets from the workshop, although I will be utilizing plenty, especially for our downtown area and some of our detailing plans that I want to try to get to later on in this series. But ultimately, the vanilla cargo station will do just fine, just at least to get us set up. That way, when we start setting up industrial, we have options for cargo to come in if necessary. And one thing I'm going to consider too is having this loop back into the rail system on the opposite side from where I'm connecting it now. So now, as you can see, we have both our train systems being connected to our city infrastructure. And this is awesome because now we have a really, really good setup to see how the city can expand into these areas, although I do think I have a pretty big map I have to fill out. With that said, the next couple episodes are going to be a little more focused on building and getting some things into our space that we have set up with infrastructure. Now remember, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can see the upcoming episodes. Leave a like and drop a comment down below with your thoughts. I'll post the previous video and the next video in the series once it's available at the end of this video. Thank you guys, take care, and I'll catch you next time.